Hi, everybody. I'm Bryan Mudd, fan of South Plains politics. Here's your talking points for this week. Some power grid reforms were passed in the legislative session, but many say it wasn't enough. We'll ask the governor if he'll tell lawmakers to try it again. And when will that happen? Last we saw the governor, he was mad about how things ended at the Capitol. See if he and everyone else have cooled down enough to make some deals.
From the studios of KAMC Television in Lubbock, your local election headquarters. This is Talking Points with Bryan Mudd.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Also this week, it takes rain to make rain. Ron Roberts says that all the time. If it rains, it means more moisture in the environment, so the next time conditions are right, we get more rain. In the case of Planned Parenthood's lawsuit against Lubbock over the abortion ban, it would take a lawsuit to make Planned Parenthood's lawsuit something a federal judge would look at. So that's part of why the lawsuit was dismissed this week. It just wasn't the judge's turn to look at it. A regular person would need to sue Planned Parenthood first and then see what the state decides. But right now, no one is likely to sue because they're not doing abortions in Lubbock right now. Planned Parenthood stopped as soon as the new law went into effect last week. I'm told that fact might actually strengthen their legal case against the city at some point, but for now, Lubbock Sanctuary City Ordinance is working as advertised. Planned Parenthood's national president, Alexis McGill Johnson, reacted by stating, despite this disappointing ruling, the fight isn't over. We remain committed to doing everything in our power to overturn this unconstitutional law. So they're not finished. But another interesting opinion came in earlier in the week from the Texas Solicitor General responding to a question from that federal judge. And KAMC's Grace Morris has more on that and another wild week in the abortion fight.
It's a very rewarding day for those who voted in favor of this ordinance.
Lubbock Sanctuary City Ordinance officially going into effect Tuesday.
This is how they voted. They do not want abortions to take place in Lubbock, Texas.
The ordinance passed with around 60% of the vote on May 1st. Soon after, Planned Parenthood filed a lawsuit against the city, claiming the ordinance violated both state and federal law. But while Planned Parenthood was unavailable for an interview, they released a statement Tuesday saying, quote, Lubbock Health Center's doors are open to provide high-quality, affordable sexual and reproductive health care services, but abortion services will be provided when legally permissible, end quote. Meaning that as of now, abortions are no longer being performed in Lubbock. Those in favor of the ordinance say it feels as if their hard work has paid off.
Thankfully, no babies were murdered today. No babies they're not planning on murdering any babies anytime this week or anytime in the near future, it looks like. That's a good thing. It's a good thing for life. It's a good thing for Lubbock. It's a good thing for all of Texas.
And in contrast to Planned Parenthood's lawsuit, the Solicitor General of Texas released a statement Monday saying that in their view, Planned Parenthood has not shown that Lubbock's ordinance is inconsistent with state law.
I hope that Planned Parenthood doesn't even consider ending the life of another child in this town. Because of course, if they do, then there's going to be consequences.
Planned Parenthood had been performing abortions since April, but now that Lubbock's clinic is no longer performing abortions, those seeking one will have to travel to the next closest clinic, which is around 300 miles away.
Okay, and Lubbock Congressman Jody Arrington's back in the district now for a little break from D.C. First, have to get your reaction to word that the Planned Parenthood lawsuit against the city of Lubbock was dismissed by the jury this week, at least for now. What do you think about all that?
I think it sounds positive to me that it was dismissed on standing, although that's not a ruling on the merits of the case. So let me say, first of all, that I'm very proud of Senator Perry for leading the charge here and of the people of Lubbock for declaring to not just Texas, the whole world, that we are a sanctuary city for the unborn. How that works its way out through the courts ultimately, how far it goes before there's a ruling on it, and even if the ruling was not in the favor of our pro-life values in Lubbock, I think it sends the right message. And there are plenty of other lawsuits and legal battles, a lot of heartbeat bills. Those are the bills in states whereby you cannot terminate a pregnancy when there's a heartbeat. That's going to be taken up by the Supreme Court. All of this momentum I see as positive. As a pro-lifer, as somebody that believes that the unborn have the same constitutional rights to life, liberty, and happiness as we do. And with the court structured the way it is and the balance of power being on pro-life conservative constitutionalist. I think there's a lot of hopeful decisions in the future. This is just one of them, and I'm proud that Lubbock and West Texas are at the fore of this movement.
Sure. A couple of things from the Texas legislative session that I wanted to ask about too. One being that Democrat walkout to avoid the vote on the voter integrity bill here. Several states are enacting things like this. There's talk at the federal level a little bit, but is this really something that's a jab at minority voters the way some have said?
No, I think that that's the narrative that the left and Democrats now are buying into, that somehow this is hearkening back to Jim Crow. It's nothing of the sort. This is not a poll tax. This is simply trying to put guardrails against fraud, human error, and corruption. There is no republic without the people consenting to be governed. How do we do that? Through elections. So what we saw in 2020 was a disaster. We had election laws changed, not by the legislature, but by courts and other bodies that were, I believe, unconstitutional.
You were the one speaking out on the House floor about all this and say, hey, this is a state issue that we should not be doing this at the federal level.
Time, place, and manner delegated to the states. States should be wise to shore up the election integrity because it is absolutely foundational to our democracy. And whether it's signature authentication or it's showing a valid ID to register, you can't get on an airplane without showing your ID. So these are basic safeguards, in my opinion, that are being politicized by, again, the left, and the Democrat Party is buying into it. And by the way, I think it is not just divisive, it's a dangerous narrative when we're so inflamed with disunity and racism in our country because of the narrative of the left. This is adding fuel to that fire, and it's a false narrative, number one, and I think it's very, very unhelpful to the cause.
Let's go to something this coming week that I think is a pretty big deal, and that's the Rural Summit that's coming up on the 10th at the Tech Museum on campus. Who's coming? What's that all about?
Well, I have a lot of my colleagues, some of the West Texas delegation, my new neighbors, Ronnie Jackson from the Amarillo area, August Pfluger from Midland, Odessa, and San Angelo. These are two new members. They're going to be great. We've got a great team for West Texas in Washington. We've got other members like my ranking member who's now retiring, Kevin Brady, Ways and Means. All of this to talk about the policies and the laws and their impact on ag, energy, and rural America, which is our way of life. Ag and energy, our bread and butter. Energy, now public enemy number one with those climate, I'll be nice, climate alarmist and their extreme environmental policies, full-on assault against oil and gas, which would be horrible for our economy and our country and our security, but it's the death knell for West Texas and some of these oil and gas communities in my district, Permian Basin, and beyond.
Hey, I saw the recent op-ed at foxnews.com, too, talking along these same lines about our cattle ranchers who seem to be a bit more of a target now for the climate crowd. It's just one of those odd things. For us who are kind of more city-locked, what's happening there, and how's that important to what's going on with our economy?
Well, they want to throw ranchers in with the oil and gas producers, so now it's our meat producers who are contributing to the apocalyptic end of the world in 10 to 12 years, according to AOC and some of the Green New Deal proponents. Ranching and cattle, the cattle industry, contribute to all of 3.7% of our total greenhouse gases. And we're producing a whole lot more cattle than anyone in the world, more sustainably, more environmentally safe and friendly than any country in the world. So global demand for food is going to double by 2050. America does this better than anyone else. It's an important part of our diet. Protein's critical to our nutritional needs. They're just trying to make a villain out of ranchers. They're looking to attack. Unfortunately, it's the very lifeblood of West Texas. But I think it's part of the. You're talking about disrupting the food supply and fuel supply. I can't think of supply chains more critical to our country's economy and security than those two.
All right, we'll continue our conversation with Congressman Arrington on next week's edition of Talking Points. And straight ahead, The he said from leadership about what went wrong to spoil the ending of the legislative session for Republicans. We'll chat with Quorum Report's Scott Braddock about what really happened and what's next.
You're watching Talking Points, a focus on the political scene in Lubbock and across the South Plains.
Welcome back. Here's a look at some of the other political headlines. The Lubbock City Council meets again Tuesday night. If you've been interested in the work of the Charter Review Committee, get there early. The committee makes its official recommendation about how to modernize the city charter, and some of these will likely be voted on by you this fall. The State Republican Party Chair Alan West resigned this week, effective July 11th. Expected that West will now run for a higher office, possibly for governor, although that might be more of an uphill battle after former President Trump's recent endorsement of Greg Abbott's reelection. And speaking of, after that wild finish in Austin, Texas lawmakers have gone home for now. The legislative session is over, but the governor's priorities were not finished, so Mr. Abbott telling KAMC West Rappaport he'll bring them all back.
Is there more to do on the power grid in a special session?
We will talk about that between now and the special session to see if there were any items that were missed. I do know from talking to legislators, they are very pleased with the product they got across the finish line.
As it relates to working out differences on key issues, that's something that you wanted lawmakers to do before you called them back for a special session. Will you share what some of those issues are right now that you want lawmakers to iron out before we get to a special?
I know you would love for me to announce on your show right now what those items will be, but I will not do that. However, as I think you may know, there are two items that I've talked about. One is election integrity. The other is bail reform. Quickly, some people may not know what bail reform is. There are some counties in the state of Texas that are releasing on bail, sometimes personal recognizance bonds, people who are dangerous criminals, who either pose a threat or actually are a threat and harm others while they are out on bond. We need to protect public safety by having bail reform that does not release back onto the streets very dangerous criminals. And so those are two items that I've already announced. There'll be more that we will be announcing later.
In terms of timeline, I know we're looking at a fall special session to tackle redistricting and some federal stimulus. Can you explain to me that your thought process on the timeline for addressing bail reform, election integrity,
Sure.
Possibly other issues?
Sure. Wes, you have to stay tuned.
All right. And in terms of the quantity of special sessions, do you have an idea as to how many we'll see?
We'll announce it when it occurs.
And is anything off the table at this point in terms of bringing lawmakers back?
Yeah, we're not putting anything on the table or off the table other than those items that I mentioned.
All right, always good to be able to spend 5 good minutes with the one and only Scott Braddock, editor of QuorumReport.com, just to talk about the state circus. And let's start with the end of the legislative session, though. For all the talk of the most conservative session ever, it sure felt in the end like Democrats, at least temporarily, saved some face with that late walkout to kill the election bill. You were right there. Was the process mismanaged by House leadership, as the lieutenant governor has been saying? What was the catalyst for all of this?
You know, Dan Patrick keeps saying that, and he's a little off base. What I mean is that you have a Republican Party primary voter who is very interested in seeing elections be secured because they feel, and this was put in their head by former President Trump, they feel that President Trump was cheated out of the last election, and so Republicans need to avenge Trump. I mean, that's where we're at now, even though that's not true. That didn't happen. Right. But the fact is that Republicans, for 5 months, could not decide on what the bill should look like to secure elections in Texas. Lieutenant Governor Patrick himself said during a news conference earlier this year, during the legislative session, that in Texas, year after year, election after election, we have secured the vote and increased voter turnout, consistently. And he said he's proud of that. And people should be proud of that. But it begs the question, what do we now need to do about elections? Does there really need to be an omnibus elections bill like Senate Bill 7? Well, Patrick says yes. The Democrats, of course, say no. And the Speaker of the House here was managing the House at the end of the legislative session. The Democrats were playing by the rules at the end, and Patrick said so, that the Democrats were playing by the rules. And so, look, I think there's something to the workflow and the work product. I mean, there's something to be said about that. But we didn't see the final version of SB 7 until about the last 72 hours of the legislative session. Yeah. And that's because Patrick's Senate and Phelan's House, the Republican leadership in both, couldn't decide what the details ought to be until then. So if the lieutenant governor wants to point fingers, you know, he might as well point one at himself as well, because if the Republican leadership was all on the same page, this could have passed weeks, if not months ago.
Governor Abbott now confirming there will be, I guess, at least 2 special sessions. One we knew would come in the fall for redistricting. Now one at some point here to at least cover that election bill and bail reform, and then who knows what. Why not call him back right away? Is he just kind of waiting for everybody to calm down here a little bit?
I think so. In one of his statements, and you hit the nail on the head, in one of Abbott's statements, he did say, and I think this was on the day of sine die, forgive me, everything's running together on me here at the end of the session, but in one of his statements, Abbott had said that before a special session can be called, lawmakers need to work out some of their differences on some of these issues. And he's right about that. When a special session is declared, and only the governor can do that, the fact that he has that authority means he also has responsibility for coming to some kind of a conclusion about whatever issue he's having them address. And the voters do hold the governor accountable whenever there isn't a clear path to a solution on whatever the issue is, whether it's voter integrity, as Democrats would call it, suppressing the vote, or if it was about bathrooms in 2017. You remember how that went, that legislative session, the special session in 2017, in a lot of ways was a failure. The governor put 20 items on it, and only about half of them passed. And some folks have said that in some ways the governor was sort of politically lucky that there was a hurricane right behind that, Hurricane Harvey at the time. It really sort of took people's focus on what had just happened in the legislature.
You know, in all of this, with a governor that's been largely hands-off in the legislative process throughout his tenure there, does he need to jump in there and play more of a direct role in lobbying for certain things in this special sessions just to get those priorities across the finish line?
He absolutely does, and it's a great point, because look, there's an odd number of the big 3 leaders for a reason. Whenever 2 of them don't agree, the other one has to jump in and sort of be the referee, and that is usually the governor's role. Governor Perry, Rick Perry, when he was the governor, he often did that, and he was a creature of the legislature. He had been a Texas House member as a Democrat years ago, who later switched to a Republican. He was also briefly the lieutenant governor. He was a creature of the process, and he understood that if the governor really rolled up his sleeves and got to work on the various issues, there would be a smoother path toward a solution, toward some sort of resolution on whatever issue he was pushing. Governor Abbott still, to this day, views his job now more like he did when he was a judge. And he said this in interviews, by the way, that his job isn't that different from when he was on the state Supreme Court or a state district court judge in Houston, that the House and Senate, the legislators ought to make their case on certain things, and during the veto period, he'll rule on those bills. One of his former staffers told me that instead of a veto period, you could call it a ruling period, because that's the way that Abbott judges it. He either gives a thumbs up or thumbs down to those bills that come to his desk.
Hey, before we go, a lot of folks here in Lubbock obviously paying closer attention to ERCOT now that we've had the change over to that power grid. What's the feeling there? Did lawmakers do enough with the weatherization mandates, the alert system, for our folks to feel better about the state of ERCOT now?
And I guess parts of Lubbock entered ERCOT just last week, right? People are watching this closely. Fact of the matter is that there were some substantive things done, but I don't think that you could just put a stamp on it and say, well, the electricity grid is fixed in Texas. That's not true. Some of the things that were done, it's targeted winterization of natural gas facilities in Texas. One huge problem that we never want to see again is natural gas couldn't get out of the ground because there was no electricity, and there was no electricity because natural gas wouldn't come out of the ground. So they're doing some work on that. And there's also a statewide alert system for outages. Another big problem was there were people all over the state in the ERCOT region who would be out of power for 5 days when they thought they were going to be without power for 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And there were people who were the complete opposite. That nothing was being communicated well, and they're trying to move forward with something on that. But as far as ensuring that we're not going to have any kind of a collapse or near collapse like we had earlier this year, I don't think you can say that.
QuorumReport.com is where to find them. They've got everything, and they've got it first. And Scott Braddock's a big reason for that. That's why we love having him on the show here. Good to see you again, my friend. Be well. We'll talk again soon.
It's my pleasure, Brian. Thank you.
And coming up, the governor's duties now include signing several bills into law. A lot of our first responders and their families not so patiently waiting for him to sign Senate Bill 22. We'll discuss why next. Before the end of the session, the legislature pushed through Senate Bill 22, sponsored by Lubbock's Dustin Burrows and others, which allows the families of first responders to receive what's called line of duty death benefits if a family member dies from COVID-19, something Rachel Vega has been fighting for since last year. And our Grace Morris is back with her story.
he had been told it would be a line of duty death as soon as he passed away.
It was almost a year ago when Sheriff Abraham Vega contracted COVID-19 while working at the Lynn County Sheriff's Department and later dying from the illness in July of 2020.
When I got the denial letter, it was just crushing. Knowing that it had been a line of duty death, our belief.
When a first responder dies in the line of duty, the family receives monetary compensation, coverage benefits, and they're honored at the state and national capital. And while more than 100 first responders in Texas have died from COVID-19, not all were receiving line of duty death designations, much like Sheriff Vega. But Senate Bill 22 changes that.
I'm fighting for this because that's what he deserves. So from July till now, I've been fighting everything I could do.
SB 22 establishes COVID-19 as a presumptive illness, which means it would be presumed that COVID-19 developed as a direct result of a first responder service, allowing families to receive line of duty death benefits.
I don't even feel like I've been able to grieve. That's been my focus, is just fighting for this. And not that I'm ever going to be over this, but just that I can be at peace.
So that the sacrifices Sheriff Vega made for his community won't soon be forgotten.
It's really for him, just the honor that I think he deserves. To be with those who did sacrifice their life in the line of duty, because he was fighting and protecting us at the end.
Grace Morris, KAMC News.
And Grace will be back with the final word. Democrat Beto O'Rourke back in Lubbock over the weekend trying to rally folks against the state election bill. We'll hear from him next week. And then send us a comment on our KAMC News Facebook page and everythinglubbock.com. Click weekly features and talking points to stream this and many of our past shows. It's all of our time. For all of us on Talking Points, we thank you for watching, and we'll see you right here again next week.